Welcome back to CSS Breakdown, book by book, where we dismantle history's pages to uncover deeper truths. In Season 6, Episode 12, we delve into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition, chapter by chapter, as we open Chapter 12. And we're confronting a really central question. In an age of unprecedented industrial growth, how did the daily lives of ordinary Victorians truly fare amidst the whirl of progress and profound social transformation? Today, we're taking a deep dive into the real, often surprising daily realities of Victorian Britain. We'll look at everything from conditions in factories and mines to how people spent their rare moments of leisure, the evolving role of women, and the profound influence of religion. It's a huge topic.
It really is. And what's fascinating here, as Lowe points out, is that the sources reveal a picture far more nuanced than just, simple linear progress. We'll explore the intense historical debates surrounding these changes and see how ordinary people truly experienced this transformative era. It wasn't straightforward at all.
Okay, so let's unpack that central question right off the bat. Did the Industrial Revolution make life better or worse for the working classes? This isn't a simple yes or no, is it?
Absolutely not. Historians have been wrestling with this for ages. E.J. Evans frames it perfectly, I think.
How so?
He asks, were the benefits of industrial advance truly enjoyed by those first-generation workers, or were they effectively sacrificed for profit, just smoothing the path for future generations? That's the core tension, really.
Right. And you definitely have the pessimists on one side. Early historians like Arnold Toynbee, writing back in the 1880s, painted a really grim picture. He called the Industrial Revolution a period as disastrous and as terrible as any through which a nation ever passed. Strong words.
Very strong. He argued that this great increase in wealth came hand in hand with an enormous increase of pauperism and the degradation, as he put it, of a large body of producers.
And there's evidence to back that up, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. For the first half of the 19th century, the gap between rich and poor in terms of income and wealth definitely widened. It's quite clear. While some skilled workers saw wage increases, many, especially agricultural laborers in the South and East, and crucially, women and children in factories and mines often saw their wages stagnate or even fall.
And you also had massive job displacement. I mean, think of the handloom weavers, the wool combers.
Completely put out of work by new machines, yes.
And then there's the problem of overproduction, which frequently led to economic depressions and mass unemployment. Lowe mentions Bolton in 1842. 60% of factory workers unemployed. That's staggering.
It is. And even physical indicators tell a grim story. National physique trends show a marked fall. Average height of 20-year-olds born between 1826 and 1850 actually fell by 2 inches.
Wow.
Yes, fell. And mortality rates rose sharply from 1830 to 1850. Simon Schrader suggests the 1830s and 40s may well have been the worst ever decades for life expectancy since the Black Death in those industrializing areas. Plus, you have all the widespread disturbances, the Chartist agitation up to 1848. That certainly suggests deep worker dissatisfaction, doesn't it?
It really does. Okay, so that's the pretty bleak, pessimistic view. But what about the optimists? What's their argument?
Well, they tend to point to statistics of wages. They argue that real wages for skilled workers doubled between, say, 1781 and 1851.
Doubled. Okay.
And that life expectancy more or less doubled too, maybe from 25 to 40, and average height increased steadily overall across the period. Some surveys also suggest increased consumerism, with workers maybe able to buy more cheap clothes and food, particularly in industrial areas like Lancashire.
And here's where it gets really interesting, as Lowe points out. The optimist's evidence is often flawed, isn't it?
That's the crucial counter-argument. Those wage statistics are averages, which can mask the severe plight of unskilled laborers compared to the skilled artisans. Averages hide a lot, and most detailed local studies actually weaken the optimist's case, at least for that first half of the century.
Right. It raises that important question. How reliable are numbers when they don't account for other crucial factors, like the cost of rent shooting up in overcrowded cities?
Exactly. Or irregular wage payments, terrible environmental conditions, or even the impact of things like the long wars with France and the Corn Laws keeping bread prices artificially high. You can't just look at wages in isolation.
So what's the balanced conclusion here?
Professor E.J. Evans, again, provides a really well-balanced summary. He says, the first generation of workers in industrial Britain, though their real wages probably improved slightly, labored in worse conditions than their parents had known.
Worse conditions. So maybe a tiny bit more money, but a much harder, more dangerous life.
Precisely. The initial benefits were primarily reaped by the middle and upper classes, followed at a respectful distance by the skilled workers. Ordinary, unskilled workers really had to wait until the price depression of the late 19th century to enjoy measurable, unequivocal benefits. By then, of course, as Evans starkly puts it, those who lived through the squalor of early 19th century Manchester were all dead.
Oof, that puts it in perspective. So the key insight is that this early industrial progress demanded a profound human cost, especially for that first generation, which leads us directly into talking about those working conditions. Why was reform so desperately needed in factories and mines?
Well, initially, there were simply no restrictions, no controls. The factory system was brand new, and owners were essentially free to treat workers however they wished. Fierce competition drove employers to pay minimal wages for maximum work, and safety precautions, well, they were practically non-existent. It cost money.
So without protection, exploitation and abuse were just inevitable.
Pretty much, yes. Inevitable.
And the accounts are horrifying. Lowe mentions machines were expensive, so industrialists ran them for as long as possible. That 1832 parliamentary committee.
Yes, that revealed thousands of small children, especially girls, working from 6 a.m. to 8:30 p.m.
16.5 hours.
With only maybe half an hour for eating. They'd literally drop off to sleep and be shaken or beaten with the strap just to stay alert.
It's hard to even imagine. And the dangers.
Immense. It was common for small children, the piecers, to clean spinning machines and looms while they were still in motion. They'd crawl under machinery less than a foot high to tie broken threads.
Unbelievable.
The 1840 Royal Commission report cited a case in Stockport. A girl caught by her clothing, carried around an upright shaft, breaking her thighs, dislocating her ankle, crippled for life. Fatal accidents were common because dangerous parts weren't boxed off.
And the long-term health consequences must have been dreadful.
Dire. Weak, curved legs, arched backs from all the bending and standing, and respiratory diseases from the hot, humid, cotton dust-filled air in textile mills were rampant.
And Lowe points out other industries were just as bad. The Staffordshire potteries.
Notorious. Charles Shaw, a potter who started at age 6, worked from 5 or 6 a.m. until 6 or 8 p.m. for a shilling a week, rushing hot plaster molds. Doctors noted potters were stunted in growth and frequently deformed in the chest. They become prematurely old and are certainly short-lived, and match factories. The infamous phossy jaw.
Flossy jaw.
Phosphorus poisoning, teeth fell out, jaw bones rotted away. Horrific.
Good grief. And mines had their own special problems, didn't they?
Yes, definitely. Mines became deeper as coal demand grew, which brought major ventilation and flooding issues. Gas explosions were frequent because the Davy safety lamp, although invented, wasn't compulsory.
And children worked down there, too.
Oh, yes. Small children, sometimes as young as 4 or 5, worked underground, hauling coal trucks through passages too low for adults, or sitting in the dark, opening and closing ventilation doors. The 1842 Royal Commission reported a 12-year-old girl carrying 100 weight of coal on her back, stooping through water in low tunnels, children climbing dangerous ladders with huge baskets of coal. The report also expressed outrage, moral outrage at naked and semi-naked men, women, girls, and boys working together, which they felt had a deeply demoralizing effect.
Just awful. So with conditions like these, the pressure for government action must have grown steadily.
It did, albeit slowly at first. The initial leader, Lowe highlights, was Richard Osler, a Leeds Tory evangelical. He was shocked by Bradford woolen mills.
What do we do?
He wrote to the Leeds Mercury in 1830, claiming child workers were treated worse than slaves. He became a famous leader, organizing mass meetings, demonstrations, leading eventually to a 130,000 signature petition to Parliament in 1832.
And inside Parliament.
Michael Sadler, another Tory evangelical, demanded a 10-hour working day for children. He was supported by humanitarians who saw it as a moral or religious crusade. But powerful opposition from factory and mine owners slowed things right down.
So those early attempts at legislation, like Sir Robert Peel, the Elders Acts in 1802 and 1819, they weren't very effective.
Largely ineffective, no. They limited apprentices' hours, but didn't apply to so-called free children. Crucially, they had no inspectors and were rarely enforced by local magistrates, who were often friends with the mill owners, you see.
Right, the enforcement problem.
Exactly. Peel's 1819 Act did bar children under 9 from cotton mills and limited 9 16-year-olds to 12 hours. Still, no inspectors meant it was largely ignored.
But Lowe says it was still an important step.
Yes, because it established the principle that Parliament could actually interfere with parents' decisions about their children's employment. That was a big crack in the prevailing laissez-faire ideology, the idea the state shouldn't interfere in the economy or private lives.
Okay. And the 1831 Act.
Similar story. Extended the 12-hour limit, but still lacked inspectors and faced issues with proving children's ages because there was no official birth registration yet. But again, significant because these first three acts, despite their weaknesses, showed governments were prepared, however reluctantly, to depart from strict laissez-faire.
So the real game changer was the Factory Act of 1833, largely thanks to Lord Ashley, who later became the famous 7th Earl of Shaftesbury.
That's the one. Actually took over the 10-hour movement after Sadler lost a seat. He pushed Sadler's bill. The Whig government, feeling the pressure, set up a royal commission. That commission was dominated by the Benthamite, Edwin Chadwick, very focused on efficiency and rational solutions. And his recommendations were key. Protect children, yes, but vitally introduce paid inspectors.
Ah, the inspectors again. So the 1833 Act, based on Chadwick's report, what did it actually do?
Passed in August 1833. No children under 9 in textile mills. 9 to 13-year-olds limited to an 8-hour day and 2 hours of education per day. 14 to 18-year-olds limited to a 12-hour day. But the most significant part was the appointment of 4 factory inspectors with the power to enter any mill. That was revolutionary.
4 inspectors for the whole country doesn't sound like much, though.
It wasn't, and challenges remained. Mill owners used clever relay systems to keep adults working long hours. Proving ages was still tricky, though compulsory birth registration in 1836 helped eventually, and the education clauses were often ineffective.
But it was a start.
A crucial start. As historian Edward Royal points out, focusing only on the weaknesses misses the real significance. Those inspectors were conscientious. They laid nearly 600 charges annually with a high success rate. And perhaps just as importantly, their official reports became powerful propaganda for further reform. They showed enforcement was possible and highlighted ongoing abuses.
So Ashley kept pushing.
Relentlessly. He showed factory work was still incredibly dangerous, leading to the Factory Act of 1844. Oddly, this allowed 8-year-olds back in, but only for 6.5-hour days. It also restricted women over 13 to 12 hours and, critically, mandated the fencing of dangerous machinery.
And he also targeted the mines you mentioned.
Yes. The shocking 1842 Royal Commission report, full of harrowing details, led directly to the Mines Act of 1842. That forbade women, girls, and boys under 10 from working underground, though, frustratingly, it only appointed 1 inspector initially.
So the famous 10-Hour Act finally passed in 1847.
Yes, championed by John Fielden. Its success was partly due to political factors. Peel's fall from power, Tory landowners wanting revenge on manufacturers after the Corn Law repeal, and a trade depression making a 10-hour day seem less threatening to profits.
But the fight wasn't quite over.
Not quite. Manufacturers revived the relay system loophole. So Ashley, back in Parliament, negotiated the Factory Act of 1850. This act limited factory opening hours to 12, between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., or 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. This effectively reduced the working day for women and young people to 10.5 hours, and because factories relied on them, men's hours were often reduced too. It also mandated Saturdays ending at 2 p.m.
That sounds like a really significant victory.
It was a great achievement. Crucially, it didn't cause the feared fall in production. In fact, workers' health and efficiency improved, and serious accidents were almost eliminated in textile mills.
And the movement broadened out from there.
It did. Shaftesbury continued pushing for protection in other trades. The Coal Mines Inspection Act, 1850, and the Mines Regulation and Inspection Act, 1860, increased the number of inspectors and raised the minimum age for boys underground again. By 1862, mines were required to have 2 shafts for escape routes. The Royal School of Mines, opened in 1851, played an invaluable role in training inspectors and developing safer techniques, leading to acts like the 1872 and 1887 Mines Acts mandating improved safety methods and first aid.
So the net of protection kept spreading.
Exactly. The Children's Employment Commission of 1862 spurred the 1867 Acts, extending factory legislation to all workshops, even ordinary houses with fewer than 50 employees. Shaftesbury even got brickfields covered in 1871. Further improvements came with the Factory Act of 1874, reducing the working day officially to 10 hours and raising the minimum employment age to 10. Finally, the Factory and Workshops Act of 1878 brought even smaller workshops under government inspection, consolidating decades of struggle.
So the key takeaway from this part of the story is really powerful, isn't it? The sheer horror of industrial labor slowly, painstakingly, forced Parliament to abandon its strict laissez-faire stance.
Precisely. It led to incremental but eventually transformative reforms that genuinely improved the lives and safety of millions of working people. It was a long, hard fight, but it shows that collective action and political pressure can bring change, even against powerful vested interests.
Okay, so while factory reform was slowly grinding through Parliament, another massive problem plagued Victorian society. the absolutely appalling state of public health, especially in those booming industrial towns. What was driving this crisis?
At its root, the sheer speed of population growth. Between 1801 and 1851, the population of England, Wales, and Scotland roughly doubled.
Doubled in 50 years.
Yes. And this massive influx concentrated in industrial cities, which simply grew much too fast to house everyone properly or provide basic services. Cities like Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester, their populations exploded by 3 to 4 times in just half a century. Bradford's population increased 8-fold.
That must have led to unbelievable overcrowding.
Extreme overcrowding. Cheap, cramped back-to-back houses and huge tenement blocks just sprang up with hardly any building regulations. Lowe gives an example from 1847. A typical London East End street had nearly 1,100 people living in just 27 houses.
That's an average of, what, 40 people per house? Maybe 8 to a room?
Easily. And almost universally, these rapidly growing towns lacked the basic amenities we take completely for granted today. Pure water, proper drainage, sewage disposal, street cleansing, even basic lighting.
So what did that mean in practice? No water closets in working-class houses.
None. Outside privies often served up to 20 houses, draining into cesspits that had to be manually emptied. Imagine the smell and filth. Doctors reported courts inundated with fluid filth and streets full of pits, brimful of stagnant water, the receptacle of dead cats and dogs.
It sounds almost medieval.
Boyd Hilton sums it up vividly. He describes large industrial towns as having brothels, gin shops, alehouses, thieves' dens, filthy courts, rookeries, communal privies, cesspools, middens, dung heaps, crawling with wild dogs and rats. He goes on. Most were noisy, smelly, filthy, smoky, dark at nighttime, blisteringly cold in winter, fly-ridden and dusty in summertime, flea and lice-ridden at all times. You definitely get the picture.
And drinking water must have been a major issue.
Huge. Only the wealthy had piped water. The rest relied on communal street standpipes or pumps, often only turned on for part of the day. And river water, always polluted, was commonly used. London's Thames received waste from no fewer than 237 sewers. A Leeds newspaper in 1841 described the River Aire, which supplied drinking water, as being charged with the contents of about 200 water closets and all sorts of other foul waste.
It's no wonder disease was rampant.
The statistics are horrifying. In 1840, 1 child in 3 died before reaching the age of 5.
1 in 3.
Cholera was perhaps the most terrifying. It first appeared in Britain in 1831, killing 21,000. An even worse epidemic in 1848-49 killed 90,000 in London alone, 2,000 deaths a week at its peak. Its progression was horrific. Vomiting, skin turning blue, purple, then brown-black, severe breathlessness, rigid spasms, and almost invariably death. And because the bacillus was waterborne, it affected rich and poor alike. Nobody was safe.
And cholera was just one threat.
Just the most dramatic. Far more common were diseases like typhus, typhoid, and tuberculosis. TB was the most lethal, causing maybe a quarter to a third of all deaths in the first half of the century. Plus scarlet fever, diphtheria, measles, ordinary diarrhea, all largely caused by contaminated water and the lack of proper sewage disposal. The national death rate rose from around 19 per thousand before 1831 to a peak of over 25 in 1849. In crowded cities like Glasgow, it could hit 49 per thousand during epidemics.
And all these problems were powerfully highlighted by Edwin Chadwick's 1842 report, weren't they?
Yes, his report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population of Great Britain was a landmark. Chadwick, a fanatical Benthamite, linked sickness directly to pauperism. He believed controlling disease would reduce the cost of poor relief. His report starkly presented life expectancy statistics that shocked the public. A professional man in a rural area might live to 52, but a laborer in a Manchester slum was lucky to reach 17. In Liverpool, only 15. The problem was, as Lowe points out, no existing body had the expertise or the funds to tackle such enormous nationwide issues.
So Chadwick's report laid bare the crisis, and he suggested concrete solutions, right? Piped water, better sewers.
He did. He envisioned piped water for all houses, flushing sewage into new, smaller, glazed pottery sewers, a much more efficient system. He advocated a centralized approach.
But progress was slow.
Painfully slow. The enormous expense was one factor. But also there was deep Victorian resistance to centralization and compulsion, especially given that powerful laissez-faire ideology. People didn't want the state telling them what to do, even if it was for their own good.
So early attempts, like the Public Health Act of 1848,
were fatally flawed because they were voluntary, not compulsory. By 1854, only 182 local boards of health were set up, covering just 2 million people out of 18 million, and many were ineffective. Chadwick's own arrogance didn't help either, and he was sacked in 1854.
So things drifted for a while.
They did. The Central Board of Health was terminated in 1858. Even a massive £3 million investment to improve London's sewage system couldn't stop 10,000 Londoners dying in the 1866 cholera epidemic. It really took the Sanitation Act of 1866 to make a difference, finally compelling local authorities to improve conditions and remove nuisances. The Times hailed it as introducing a new sanitary era.
Gladstone's Liberals tried again in 1872.
Yes, the Public Health Act of 1872 clarified health authorities, but it too failed due to unclear duties and reluctance to spend the necessary money.
So it was left to Disraeli and the Conservatives.
It was. R.A. Cross's Public Health Act of 1875 truly rationalized health legislation. This act laid down clear, compulsory duties for local authorities: provide adequate water supply, drainage, sewage disposal, remove nuisances, regulate offensive trades, confiscate contaminated food. Infectious diseases had to be notified. It's widely considered one of the greatest, most impactful pieces of 19th century legislation.
And Cross also brought in the Artisans' Dwellings Act in the same year.
Yes, giving local authorities the power to buy and demolish insanitary slum properties. Although powerful opposition from property owners prevented making slum clearance compulsory at that stage, Birmingham, under Mayor Joseph Chamberlain, was a pioneer in using these powers. Later acts in 1890 and 1900 finally compelled local authorities to demolish unhealthy housing and provide alternatives. But a major opportunity for systematic town planning was sadly missed in 1909.
And alongside all this legislation, medical advances were happening too.
Crucial advances. We had earlier steps like Jenner's smallpox vaccination and Humphrey Davy discovering nitrous oxide as an anesthetic. But the mid-century saw bigger breakthroughs. Chloroform was introduced as a general anesthetic in the late 1840s, giving surgeons more time. But infection remained a huge killer until Louis Pasteur developed his germ theory of disease in the early 1860s.
And that led to Lister's work.
Exactly. Building on Pasteur's work, the Glasgow surgeon Joseph Lister developed antiseptic surgery using carbolic acid spray. After his first successful use in 1865, the death rate after operations in his male accident ward fell dramatically from 45% to just 15% in 4 years. His ideas gained acceptance, and he was eventually knighted.
And nursing improved too.
Steadily improved thanks to figures like Elizabeth Fry and, of course, Florence Nightingale. Her work, now recognized as laying the foundation for the modern healthcare system, included persuading authorities to train nurses properly and revamping the dreadful workhouse infirmaries. Plus, the Medical Act of 1858 set up a council to supervise doctor training and efficiency.
And all this required massive engineering projects too, didn't it?
Remarkable civil engineering. Manchester's Long Dendale Waterworks, started in 1847, cost a fortune, £750,000, but by 1857 supplied 30 million gallons of clean water a day compared to just 2 million previously. Liverpool followed suit. London's main waterized sewers, a huge undertaking by Joseph Bazalgette, were completed by 1866. Most major cities had similar schemes by 1900.
So despite all these improvements, the death rate was still quite high in 1870.
Yes, around 24 per thousand. It slowly dropped to below 18 per thousand by 1901. But even then, epidemics still occurred, and the work of social investigators like Charles Booth and Seabohm Rowntree showed that the final victory over filth and infectious diseases was still some way off. But what really emerges from the public health story isn't just the science or the engineering, important as they were. It's a stark reminder again of how political will, pushed relentlessly by horrifying human suffering and the tireless work of reformers like Chadwick, was ultimately the engine of change, eventually overcoming even deeply entrenched laissez-faire beliefs. It showed the state had to intervene.
Okay, so we've looked at the physical battles for survival in the factories and the squalid towns. But what about the minds of these Victorians? How did this burgeoning industrial society grapple with the challenge of educating its rapidly growing, often exploited population? What kind of schools were actually available? And why did it take so long for a proper state system to emerge?
Well, as Lowe emphasizes, before 1870, there was hardly anything you could call an educational system at all in Britain. It was incredibly fragmented. The government took very little interest and provided almost no financial support before 1833. Schools were basically a confusing hodgepodge run by private individuals, various religious groups, and some old city companies.
So you had the famous public schools at the top, like Eton and Harrow.
Right, though despite the name public, they were exclusively for the wealthy elite. Their curriculum was heavily classical Latin and Greek, though mathematics was gradually introduced by progressive headmasters like Thomas Arnold of Rugby.
And below them.
You had older grammar schools, also fee-paying, but sometimes with a few free places for poorer local boys, similarly focused on the classics. Then there were newer private schools catering to middle-class families who wanted more practical subjects like mathematics, modern languages, and science.
But for the vast majority of the population, these were completely out of reach, weren't they?
Totally out of reach. Most children lucky enough to get any schooling received just the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, in what were known generally as voluntary schools.
Yeah.
This category included Sunday schools, which were widespread, dame schools, often little more than basic child-minding by elderly women in their homes, and various charity schools.
And didn't the Factory Acts lead to some schools?
Yes, after the 1833 Act mandated some education for child workers, some factory schools were set up. And during the 1840s, you saw the emergence of ragged schools in very deprived urban areas, with Lord Ashley heavily involved as president. But the most widespread providers of elementary education were the religious societies. The Church of England's National Society and the Nonconformist Church's British and Foreign Schools Society.
And they didn't always get along.
Bitter rivalry, often. But they used similar teaching methods, relying heavily on the cheap monitorial system pioneered by people like Andrew Bell and Joseph Lancaster. Older pupils taught younger ones to save money and cope with the chronic shortage of trained teachers. As Lancaster himself said, the whole system of tuition is almost entirely conducted by boys.
So the quality must have varied enormously.
Wildly. And in some industrial areas, there were simply no schools for working-class children at all. Lowe cites figures showing that in 1818, only about 1 in 17 of the population received any kind of elementary education.
So why did it take so incredibly long for the government to step in and create a state system?
Well, largely the same reasons we saw hindering factory and health reforms, that powerful laissez-faire outlook. The prevailing view was, if the poor wanted education, it was up to them or charity to provide it. It wasn't the government's responsibility, and certainly not its financial burden.
And there were other arguments against educating the poor, too.
Oh, yes. There's a strong belief, particularly among employers in the upper classes, that educating the working classes was simply unnecessary. They only needed basic job skills, which they could learn on the job. And if children were in school, industrialists would lose their vital source of cheap labor.
And maybe even a fear of an educated working class.
Definitely. That was perhaps even more significant. An educated working class was seen as potentially dangerous. Lowe quotes an MP in 1807, Davies Giddy, saying education would teach workers to despise their lot in life and render them insolent to their superiors, enabling them to read seditious pamphlets. Another MP in 1825 feared national ruin if the lower orders got even a smattering of knowledge.
Wow. So how did things start to change?
Gradually, those favoring state intervention gained ground. The Whig government in 1833 made the first tentative breakthrough. It didn't provide schools itself, but it did offer funding to the voluntary societies.
How much funding?
Initially, just £20,000 for school buildings. By 1839, this increased to £30,000, and a committee was set up led by Sir James K. Shuttleworth, who'd been a doctor in the Manchester slums and really understood the problems to supervise the spending. K. Shuttleworth was crucial. He introduced school inspectors whose reports revealed just how inefficient the monitorial system really was.
And teacher training started then, too.
Yes, the 1840s saw the first teacher training colleges established. K. Shuttleworth also introduced his pupil teacher scheme, where able older students were apprenticed for 5 years to become teachers. Government grants for these initiatives rose steadily, reaching £500,000 by 1856 when a proper Department of Education was finally set up.
But even with this progress, it wasn't enough.
Not nearly enough. The Newcastle Commission reported in 1861 that while maybe 1 in 7 children received some education, most still couldn't properly read or write. This shocking finding led the politician Robert Lowe to introduce his highly controversial payment by results system in 1862.
Payment by results. What did that involve?
Essentially, government grants to schools and even teachers' salaries depended directly on how well pupils performed in annual examinations covering the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic.
That sounds like it would put immense pressure on schools.
It did. While it arguably made schools more efficient and certainly saved the government money, it was heavily criticized for encouraging rote learning and mechanical cramming, narrowing the curriculum drastically, and ignoring subjects beyond the basics. It also caused considerable nervous strain for teachers. Yet, remarkably, this system lasted until 1897.
Okay, so that brings us to 1870, which Lowe presents as a real turning point. Gladstone's Liberal government finally decided the state must step in and ensure every child received an education, even if it meant the state providing the schools itself. Why the sudden shift?
Several key reasons converged. A really important one was the 1867 Reform Act, which had given the vote to many urban working-class men. As Robert Lowe himself famously stated in 1867, "From the moment you entrust the masses with power, their education becomes an imperative necessity. You must therefore give them an education." It was partly about educating the new voters.
So education is a form of social control, perhaps, making the working classes less prone to revolution.
That view certainly exists. Instilling moral values like hard work, thrift, self-restraint through schooling was seen by some as a way to manage the potentially unruly masses. However, Lowe also credits Gladstone with a genuine belief in providing equality of opportunity for all, which was also a significant driver.
Were there other factors?
Yes. Britain was becoming increasingly aware it was lagging behind countries like Prussia and the USA in terms of education. Both those countries were doing well militarily and economically, which helped swing opinion in Britain towards the need for mass education to remain competitive.
And the sheer scale of the problem.
Exactly. Rapid population growth meant the voluntary societies simply couldn't keep up with demand. In some industrial cities, fewer than 1 in 10 children were getting any education at all. The existing system was clearly failing.
And the economy could afford it by then.
Finally, yes. Britain's economy was booming in the mid-Victorian period, making it feasible for the government to finance a comprehensive state system.
So tell us about Forster's Education Act of 1870. It sounds like it was a balancing act.
A very tricky balancing act. W.E. Forster, who headed the education department under Gladstone, had to find a way to fill the gaps in provision without alienating the powerful existing religious schools, particularly the Anglicans and the nonconformists. The result was a classic British compromise.
What did it do?
Essentially, existing Anglican and nonconformist voluntary schools were allowed to continue and received increased government grants. But crucially, in areas where there wasn't a voluntary school or not enough places, locally elected school boards were set up. These boards had the power to organize new board schools for children aged 5 to 12, funded by a combination of government grants, fees paid by parents, and, significantly, local rates, local property taxes.
And religious education in these new board schools.
That was contentious. It was decided by each local board, but restricted by the Cowper Temple Clause to undenominational Bible study, no specific church catechisms or formularies allowed.
Was attendance compulsory immediately or free?
Not yet, no. Attendance wasn't made fully compulsory until 1881, and elementary education wasn't made free until 1891. Forster's Act allowed boards to pay the fees for poor children, but it wasn't universally free from the start.
And this act caused a political storm.
A huge political row. Religious bodies resented the board schools getting money from local rates while they didn't initially. Nonconformists were particularly annoyed. They felt their position was weakened while Anglican schools were strengthened by increased grants. And they hated having to pay local rates that might end up funding what they saw as godless board schools, or even potentially subsidizing Anglican schools if poor children's fees were paid there. This religious feuding made establishing an effective national system quite difficult and drawn out.
But despite the controversy and the resulting dual system, state schools alongside voluntary schools, Lowe concludes the act was still hugely important.
Absolutely. He calls it a remarkable piece of social legislation, playing a vital part in civilizing the masses in the nation's vast industrial cities. And the impact was immediate. Between 1870 and 1880, the number of children receiving elementary education more than doubled, reaching almost 3 million. Thousands of new board schools sprang up across the country.
And further developments followed.
Yes. Sandon's Education Act in 1876 encouraged attendance by making parents legally responsible. Mandela's Act in 1881, as mentioned, made attendance compulsory for 5 10-year-olds. The Fee Grant Act of 1891 finally abolished fees in most elementary schools, making education effectively free for the first time.
And the end of payment by results.
That system was gradually phased out towards the end of the 19th century. Education quality improved, with a greater focus shifting towards, as Lowe puts it, the development of interest and intelligence, rather than just rote learning.
What was the next major landmark after 1870?
That would be the Balfour Education Act of 1902. This was another really significant piece of legislation. It abolished the school boards and placed both the voluntary schools and the former board schools under newly created local education authorities, LEAs, usually county councils or county borough councils. These LEAs also became responsible for secondary and technical education, marking a big step forward there. Crucially, the act also allowed voluntary schools, mostly Anglican and Catholic, to receive money from local rates to help raise their standards to match the board schools.
So, more uniformity and state control over secondary education.
Yes, it meant a general raising of elementary standards and more uniformity across the country. And the state explicitly taking responsibility for secondary education led to the rise of many state-funded grammar schools in the early 20th century. However, it perpetuated the dual system and, again, massively disappointed nonconformists who now had to contribute through their rates to Anglican and Roman Catholic schools, which they deeply resented.
Were there further steps towards secondary education for all?
Some important ones. The Liberal government elected in 1906 introduced a system where secondary schools receiving state grants had to reserve 25% of their places free for children coming from elementary schools on scholarships, the beginnings of the scholarship ladder.
And H.A.L. Fisher's Education Act of 1918.
That raised the school leaving age to 14 and required local authorities to provide part-time day continuation classes for young people up to age 18, though this was poorly funded after the war. It also increased grants for secondary schools and state scholarships for university entrance.
So education had clearly come a very long way by the early 20th
A
century.
huge distance. However, as Lowe notes, Fisher's continuation classes were largely a dead letter due to post-war austerity. And while an educational ladder had been established, allowing some bright working-class children to climb up, it was still pretty rare for them to reach university. As the social commentator J.A. Hobson lamented around that time, what was truly needed was not an educational ladder, narrowing as it rises, but a broad, easy stair, one which will entice everyone to rise. That ideal was still a long way off.
Right. So beyond the often grim realities of work, public health, and the slow development of education, how did ordinary Victorians actually live day to day? How did they find enjoyment? This brings us to the emergence of class, doesn't it?
It really does. The 19th century saw the development and hardening of distinct class concepts. You had the working class, a broad term for manual laborers, whether in factories, mines, agriculture, or as domestic servants. And the middle class, generally brain workers, like office staff, shopkeepers, teachers, doctors, factory owners, financiers.
But Lowe stresses these were broad categories with huge variations within them.
Absolutely. A farm laborer in the South might earn only 6 shillings a week, while a skilled shipyard worker in the North could make 50 shillings more than many poorly paid clerks who consider themselves middle class, and wealthy industrialists enjoyed lifestyles much closer to the old aristocracy.
And the aristocracy itself,
Well,
based on land and rents.
they faced challenges to their preeminent position, especially with parliamentary reforms shifting power. Some became even wealthier from discovering coal or iron on their land, but others declined, particularly with the agricultural depressions later in the century. Meanwhile, wealthy middle-class individuals often aspired to join the upper class, buying land and adopting aristocratic lifestyles.
So class was complicated.
Very complicated. Historians Black and McRae note that by the 1880s, a classic them-and-us working-class mentality was in existence, but class wasn't just about money. It involved layers of tradition, manners, accents, family connections, bloodlines, all influencing social acceptance.
Okay, so what about leisure? Did ordinary Victorians have any?
Well, in the early 19th century, most manual workers endured those 6-day-long work weeks, leaving very little leisure time or spare money. However, as we discussed, working hours gradually reduced, particularly after the 1850 Factory Act specified that 2 p.m. Saturday closing time for factories. As real wages slowly increased, especially later in the century, so did the capacity for leisure.
And what did they do at that time? Drinking seems to have been popular.
Very popular across all classes. Annual beer consumption rose significantly throughout the century. Pubs were almost exclusively working-class domains. They weren't just places to drink, they were vital social centers, hosting meetings for friendly societies, trade unions, and craft societies. Middle and upper classes tended to drink in their private clubs, hotels, or at home. This difference in drinking venues actually increased the social gulf between the classes.
What about other pastimes? Lowe mentions blood sports.
Yes, early 19th century working-class pastimes included things like cockfighting, dogfighting, and bear baiting. Crucially, these were often enjoyed by all classes, mainly because of the opportunities for gambling. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, founded 1824, which Queen Victoria later supported, campaigned vigorously against these, and they were eventually made illegal.
It's still ironic, isn't it, that laws against cruelty to animals seem to gain traction before laws against cruelty to child workers.
It is a striking irony, yes. Public executions were also extremely popular spectacles until they were abolished in 1868. Lowe cites an estimate of 100,000 people watching one hanging in London in 1849.
Good heavens. What else?
Horse racing gained huge popularity throughout the century, again patronized by all classes, largely due to gambling. Bookmakers operated widely for the urban working class who could travel cheaply by train to race courses near major towns.
And hunting and shooting.
Initially upper-class preserves, but shared by the wealthier middle classes by the mid-century. Fox hunting, deer stalking in the Scottish Highlands, and bird shooting became widespread obsessions for those who could afford them.
What about organized sports?
With the spread of that free Saturday afternoon, spectator sports really took off. Soccer, rugby, and cricket became incredibly popular. The Football Association was formed in 1863 with the first FA Cup final in 1871. Early teams were often based around churches or railway companies. Soccer quickly became mainly a working-class entertainment, professionalized early on, offering some players a chance to supplement meager wages.
And rugby and cricket.
Rugby was enjoyed by all classes until it split in the 1890s into the Amateur Rugby Union and the Professional Rugby League, mainly in the north of England. Cricket became the national summer game, played and watched by our classes, but it featured that rather demeaning distinction between unpaid gentlemen, amateurs, usually upper middle class, and paid players, professionals, usually working class. Foreign observers often saw this as the epitome of the English class system. Despite this, county championships and later test matches drew enormous crowds.
But some sports remained exclusive.
Yes, tennis and golf, which grew rapidly in popularity later in the century, remained strictly middle and upper class preserves.
Okay, so sports were big. What about music? Lowe mentions that some foreign observers called Victorian Britain a land without music. Was that fair?
Not at all. The Victorians were extremely musical in all sorts of ways. Music halls became increasingly popular throughout the era. They offered a diverse mix of songs, orchestral music, dance, acrobatics, comedy, often quite risque. These packed halls drew both working and middle-class audiences, and even aristocrats sometimes slumming it for excitement.
And Gilbert and Sullivan.
Hugely popular. Their comic operas appealed right across the classes with their witty social and political satire. They were so successful, the purpose-built Savoy Theatre was constructed for them in 1881.
What about amateur music making?
Immensely popular, especially in Wales and the north of England. Amateur choral singing, huge choirs, and brass bands were a massive part of community life, with thousands gathering for keenly fought contests. Religious music, especially big oratorios like Handel's Messiah or Mendelssohn's Elijah, were regular favorites performed by professional orchestras and countless amateur choirs.
And orchestral music itself.
It gained traction, too. Manchester's Halle Orchestra, founded in 1858 by Charles Halle, explicitly aimed for the whole musical education of the public. They offered low-priced seats, allowing working-class music lovers to hear works by Beethoven, Mozart, and later native composers like Elgar. Halle was eventually knighted. However, pay for professional musicians often remained low. George Bernard Shaw complained in 1889 that music was the worst-funded art, blaming the aristocracy for not patronizing it seriously, unlike racing or even millinery.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift focus now to the position and role of women in Victorian society. Lowe paints a picture of them being treated in many ways as second-class citizens.
Very much so. The prevailing ideology held that women were naturally more caring, less aggressive, suited for the domestic sphere. Their roles were confined to these separate spheres, women in the home, men in the public world of work and politics.
So a woman's primary place was as the angel of the house.
That was the ideal, yes. Being a good wife and mother, creating a comfortable haven, making life smooth for her husband, who was the breadwinner. Marriage was seen as the ideal, indeed the necessary state for women. Statistics showed that the vast majority, about 85% of girls aged 15, could expect to be married by 50. Unmarried women, especially in the upper and middle classes, were often seen as failures, pitied, and faced real financial difficulties later in life. Charlotte Bronte bemoaned the lack of fulfilling earthly employment for single women beyond basic household work.
And marriage itself came with significant problems for women, legally speaking.
Huge problems. When a woman married, historically, all her money and possessions automatically became her husband's property. She essentially ceased to exist as a separate legal entity from him. If the marriage failed, even if the husband was entirely at fault, he legally kept custody of the children.
And divorce.
Nearly impossible for women before 1857. It required an expensive private act of parliament. Even the 1857 Divorce Act, which allowed divorce through the courts, was very costly, maybe £100, far too expensive for the working class, and heavily biased towards men. A husband could sue for divorce simply on grounds of his wife's adultery. A wife could only sue her husband for adultery if it was combined with other offenses like desertion, incest, bigamy, bestiality, or extreme cruelty.
And domestic violence was an issue?
A significant issue. Husbands often spent their wages in pubs, leading to drunkenness and wife-beating, with very little legal protection or recourse for wives and children.
Plus the burden of constant childbirth.
Yes, a lack of reliable contraception meant almost constant pregnancy and childbirth for most married women throughout their fertile years. Pregnancy and birth were dangerous. Infant and child mortality rates were high, yet families were still large, often with 7 or more surviving children. For working-class women trying to manage on low incomes, raising so many children was a relentless struggle. This made abortion, although illegal and dangerous, fairly common.
And women were expected not to work outside the home.
That was the middle and upper-class ideal, yes. Women were not expected to pursue professional careers. They were barred from obtaining university degrees for much of the period and excluded from professions like medicine, law, and accountancy. They couldn't be magistrates, sit on juries, vote in general elections, or become MPs. And women who did work outside the home were invariably paid less than men for the same job.
What was the justification for this exclusion?
One common argument, as Lowe notes, was the claim that women were inherently too emotional, especially during menstruation, referred to euphemistically as poorly times, to make rational decisions required in professions or politics. This was used as an argument against female involvement in higher education, sport, and political life.
But despite this separate spheres ideology, many women did work.
Absolutely, out of sheer economic necessity. The 1851 census showed that over a third, 34.6% of British women were in paid work. That's 2.8 million women. This rose to 4.8 million by 1901.
What kind of work were they doing?
The largest single category by far was domestic service. Nearly 1.5 million women were servants by 1871. Industrialization also brought new opportunities, particularly in textile mills in Lancashire and Yorkshire, where over 800,000 women worked by 1911, though the better paid, more skilled jobs were reserved for men. Women also worked in industries like cutlery in Sheffield as dressmakers, tailors, often in terrible sweated conditions, and in agriculture, although female agricultural labor declined sharply over the century.
Were married working women criticized?
Often, yes, for supposedly neglecting their families. But Lowe points out that recent historians suggest their homes were actually likely to be better off due to the increased family income. High child mortality was more likely due to general poverty and unhealthy urban environments than maternal neglect.
Did women work from home?
Some did paid work at home, outwork, like sewing, assembling small items, or taking in laundry or lodgers to make ends meet. Very few women could aspire to higher status jobs, though some educated middle-class women became governesses or teachers in the growing number of girls' schools. Interestingly, as Lowe notes, many of the best-selling novelists of the early 19th century were women, including Jane Austen, the Brontes, and Elizabeth Gaskell. Writing was one profession open to them.
Now, Lowe highlights a particularly shocking development in the 1860s, the Contagious Diseases Acts.
Yes, these caused outrage among the growing feminist movement. Passed in the 1860s, these acts applied to garrison towns and naval ports. They allowed police to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute. Suspicion was often enough. These women could then be forced to undergo intimate medical examinations for venereal disease. If found infected, they could be locked up in special hospitals for months.
But the men weren't targeted.
No. As the writer A.N. Wilson points out, the acts took it completely for granted that soldiers and sailors needed access to prostitutes. The legislation enshrined in law the idea that women were the source of contamination, with no attempt to penalize the male clients who were spreading the diseases. The horrific abuses caused by these acts, and the long, difficult campaign led by women like Josephine Butler to get them repealed, were a powerful stimulus to the broader women's movement.
So from this context of really quite profound inequality, a campaign to improve the status of women gradually emerged.
It did. Lowe traces its roots back to early figures like Mary Wollstonecraft, whose 1792 book A Vindication of the Rights of Women argued that if girls received the same education as boys, women would be better wives and mothers, and crucially, society would benefit from their talents. Her ideas were too advanced for her time but gained influence by the 1840s.
And figures like Elizabeth Fry.
Yes, the Quaker prison reformer. She was horrified by the treatment of women in places like Newgate Prison and campaigned for sex separation, female warders, and education for female prisoners, influencing the Jails Act of 1823.
And Caroline Norton.
A poet and novelist who experienced the harshness of the law firsthand. After separating from her abusive husband, he denied her access to their children. She campaigned tirelessly for legal protection for married women. Her efforts contributed to the Infant Custody Bill of 1839, which gave mothers some rights and, crucially, played a role in shaping the 1857 Divorce Act, which, although flawed, did give married women the right to keep their own property and earnings if they were legally separated or deserted, and the right to sue and make contracts in their own name.
And perhaps the best-known pioneer was Florence Nightingale.
Absolutely. After her heroic work organizing nursing during the Crimean War, she gained enormous prestige. She used this influence relentlessly to improve conditions in military hospitals and, critically, to professionalize the training of nurses, founding her famous nursing school at St. Thomas's Hospital in London in 1860. She also worked tirelessly behind the scenes to improve conditions in workhouses, advocating for trained nurses in their infirmaries and developing plans for a comprehensive social welfare system.
And Elizabeth Garrett Anderson broke into medicine.
Yes, Elizabeth Garrett campaigned determinedly to allow women into the medical profession. She had to get her degree in Paris, but eventually qualified and became the first woman admitted to the British Medical Association. She was instrumental in founding the London School of Medicine for Women in 1874.
So by the mid to late century, the women's rights movement was gaining momentum.
Definitely. It was supported by influential publications like the English Women's Journal and by prominent men like the philosopher John Stuart Mill, whose powerful 1869 book, The Subjection of Women, made a passionate plea for complete legal and social equality.
And education for girls was a key focus.
A major focus. Pioneers like Frances Mary Buss and Dorothea Beale founded academically rigorous schools like the North London Collegiate School for Ladies and Cheltenham Ladies College, introducing modern curricula beyond just accomplishments. By the end of the century, there were thousands of private girls' schools, though still largely inaccessible to working-class girls.
Did progress extend to universities?
Slowly. London University was the first to allow women to take its degrees in 1878. Cambridge and Oxford opened women's colleges, Girton and Newnham at Cambridge, Lady Margaret Hall and Somerville at Oxford in the 1870s and 1880s. But astonishingly, women couldn't actually receive degrees from Oxford until 1920, and Cambridge held out until 1948. They could study and sit exams, but not formally graduate.
Incredible. Were there other important legal milestones?
Yes. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 was hugely significant. It finally allowed married women to own and control their own property separately from their husbands, whether acquired before or after marriage. The Guardianship of Children Act, 1886, gave mothers more rights regarding custody if a marriage broke up. And, as mentioned, the much-hated Contagious Diseases Acts were finally repealed in 1886 after years of campaigning led by Josephine Butler.
And women made some political gains, too.
Some limited but important gains in local government. House-owning women, mostly widows and single women, gained the right to vote in local municipal elections by 1869. They could vote in county and borough council elections by 1888. And by 1894, both married and unmarried women who met the property qualifications could vote for and even stand for election to urban and rural district councils and parish councils.
Yet, despite all these successes in education, law, and local politics, progress seemed to stall in some areas.
It did, particularly in the political sphere at the national level. After all these hard-won victories, the most striking injustice remained. Women were still denied the right to vote in general elections for parliament. That right was only finally extended, and even then only to women over 30 who met certain property qualifications after the immense contributions of women during the First World War in the representation of the Papal Act of 1918. Full equal suffrage with men didn't come until 1928.
Right. Okay, finally, let's turn to religion. Lowe stresses, it's hard for us today to grasp just how central religion was to Victorian life.
Absolutely. And also how intense the feelings between different denominations could be. It wasn't just theological debate. It sometimes spilled over into riots and violence.
So what was the religious landscape like around 1800?
Britain was overwhelmingly Christian, apart from substantial and long-established Jewish communities in cities like London. Church attendance was generally high across society, much higher than today. But within Christianity, there were many different groups. You had the Protestant Anglicans, the Official Church of England, the related Episcopal Church in Scotland, and the Church of Ireland. Then you had numerous groups of dissenters or nonconformists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Congregationalists, Unitarians, and increasingly important, Roman Catholics.
And all these groups provided more than just spiritual support.
Much more. They provided a vital sense of community and identity in a time of rapid social change and urbanization.
They offered ceremonies for key life stages, baptism, marriage, funerals. They provided moral guidance, charitable support, and a whole range of social activities.
Let's start with Anglicanism, the established church. Right. The Anglican Church was the official state church in England and Wales, with the monarch as its supreme governor. It had immense wealth and political influence. 26 bishops held seats in the House of Lords. For much of the period, only Anglicans could hold important state positions or attend Oxford and Cambridge universities or graduate from them.
And this privileged position caused resentment.
Huge resentment among nonconformists and Catholics. They campaigned throughout the century for disestablishment, removing the Anglican Church's official status. This goal was achieved in Ireland in 1869 and eventually in Wales in 1920, but not in England itself.
Was the Anglican Church seen as declining in the early 19th century?
Some contemporaries believed so, but its status as the state church and its strong alliance with the Tory party maintained its power and influence. It was generally seen as opposing radical change, opposing Catholic emancipation, earning it the nickname the Tory party at prayer.
And there were different strands within Anglicanism.
Yes, several distinct parties or traditions. You had the Low Church or latitudinarian tradition, often seen as somewhat detached, viewing the church almost as a department of state concerned mainly with public morality.
Right.
Then the evangelicals, probably the largest and most influential group, especially in the first half of the century. They emphasized personal conversion, salvation by faith alone, humility, intense prayer, Bible study, and active service to others. Think of William Wilberforce, the anti-slavery campaigner, or Lord Shaftesbury, the factory reformer key evangelicals driven by their faith. And the High Church Party, they stressed the church's spiritual authority, its continuity from the apostles through a hierarchy of bishops and priests, apostolic succession, and the vital importance of sacraments administered by ordained clergy.
Okay, what about the Methodists?
Methodism originated within the Church of England in the 18th century with John and Charles Wesley at Oxford. They emphasized personal experience, salvation through faith, and living a strict moral life. They encouraged ordinary people to read the Bible for themselves. Their strict moral code condemned things like sexual misbehavior, excessive drinking, gambling, and cruel sports.
But they faced opposition initially.
Yes, early Methodists often faced abuse and mob violence. Wesley frequently had to preach outdoors because churches were closed to him. After Wesley's death in 1791, Methodism gradually separated from the Anglican Church, becoming a powerful nonconformist denomination centered on local chapels. A key feature was the significant role played by lay people, ordinary members in leading services and organizing the chapels.
And who did Methodism appeal to?
Methodism, and nonconformism generally, tended to attract the growing middle classes and skilled working classes, particularly in the new industrial areas. Politically, they generally leaned towards the Whig or Liberal parties, in contrast to the Tory-aligned Anglican Church. There were also splits within Methodism, like the Primitive Methodists, who were particularly strong among urban workers and miners.
What about other dissenting or nonconformist churches?
The oldest groups included the Congregationalists, or Independents, who believed each congregation should be autonomous. Oliver Cromwell was famously an independent. The Baptists, who believed in adult baptism by total immersion, grew rapidly and were very active in campaigns for religious equality. And the Presbyterians, governed by elected elders and church courts called presbyteries, were numerous, especially in Scotland, but also influential in England.
And the Unitarians were different.
Yes, Unitarians were unique among Protestant groups and rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. They believed in God as a single divine personality and saw Jesus as a great prophet and teacher, but not as divine himself. They also tended to reject the idea of eternal punishment and were often more relaxed about strict moral behavior compared to evangelicals or Methodists. Their chapels often became quite ornate. Unitarianism was particularly popular among the intellectual and business classes, and they were pioneers in introducing science and modern languages into their schools.
And the Roman Catholic Church.
In England, the Catholic Church was at a low ebb numerically in 1800, maybe only 60,000 adherents, but its numbers increased dramatically, mainly due to immigration from Ireland, especially after the famine in the 1840s. By 1851, there were perhaps 750,000 Catholics in England and Wales. Catholics, of course, recognized the Pope in Rome as the head of the Church and held distinctive doctrines like transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine fully become the body and blood of Christ during Mass.
And they faced prejudice.
Intense prejudice and suspicion. Catholicism was widely viewed by Protestants as an alien, dangerous threat. Lowe quotes contemporaries describing it as pseudo-magical and superstitious and sinister. Catholics were excluded from most areas of public life for much of the early period.
So religion and politics were deeply intertwined, especially between 1820 and 1846.
Incredibly intertwined. The Act of Union in 1800, which formally united Great Britain and Ireland, brought a large number of Irish MPs into the Westminster Parliament. Irish Catholics had expected Catholic emancipation, the right to sit in Parliament and hold high office, as part of the deal, but King George III stubbornly refused it, causing deep bitterness in Ireland. The lawyer Daniel O'Connell brilliantly led the campaign for emancipation.
And this led to a crisis.
Yes, tensions peaked in 1828-29. The Tory government under the Duke of Wellington first repealed the old Test and Corporation Acts, which had prevented Protestant nonconformists from holding important public posts, but they initially excluded Catholics. O'Connell then won a by-election in Ireland, but, as a Catholic, couldn't take his seat. Fearing widespread civil war in Ireland, Wellington and his Home Secretary, Robert Peel, reluctantly granted full Catholic emancipation in 1829, allowing Catholics to sit in Parliament and hold most offices. This deeply split their own Tory party, contributing to its later defeat.
But emancipation didn't solve all the problems in Ireland.
Far from it. Irish Catholics, who were over 90% of the population, still had to pay tithes, a tax, essentially 1/10 of their agricultural produce, to support the established Protestant Church of Ireland, which represented only a tiny minority. This caused enormous resentment, leading to violent incidents, the Tithe War, and widespread refusal to pay.
And attempts to reform this caused problems in England.
Yes. When the Whig government tried to reform the Church of Ireland in 1833 with their Irish temporalities, bill proposing to reduce the number of Anglican bishoprics and use the surplus revenues for educational projects, it caused outrage among Anglicans in England, who saw it as an attack on church property. It even contributed to the Prime Minister, Earl Grey, resigning.
But some progress was made for nonconformists and Catholics.
Some important practical steps were taken. The Marriage Act of 1836 finally legalized marriages conducted in nonconformist chapels and Roman Catholic churches, ending the Anglican monopoly. The Tithe Commutation Act, also in 1836, converted tithes from payment in kind to fixed money payments based on corn prices and slightly reduced their overall value, which eased tensions somewhat in England, though O'Connell still demanded total abolition in Ireland.
And Peel tried further concessions later.
During his ministry from 1841 to 1846, Peel tried to win Catholic support in Ireland with concessions like increased government funding for the Catholic seminary at Maynooth. But this only managed to upset staunch Anglicans and many nonconformists in Britain, further dividing his own party just before the Corn Laws crisis broke.
So, turning back to Anglicanism itself, it faced a period of crisis in the early 19th century.
Yes, it faced significant challenges. Falling attendances in some areas, strong opposition from other denominations and political radicals who resented its privileged status, the exclusion of nonconformists from universities and many public posts. Even after 1828, practical barriers remained. And the issue of church rates, compulsory annual payments by all local property owners, regardless of their religion, for the upkeep of the local Anglican parish church was bitterly resented and led to protests, refusals to pay, and even imprisonments until Gladstone finally abolished them in 1868.
And there were criticisms of the church's effectiveness.
Many felt Anglicans were failing to respond adequately to the huge social and economic changes brought by the Industrial Revolution. Nonconformists and Roman Catholics often seemed more successful in ministering to the needs of the working classes in the rapidly growing, often neglected industrial towns.
Why was that?
As E.J. Evans describes it, the Church of England was often overstocked with clergymen in the wrong places. Too many clergy held multiple parishes, plurality, or didn't even live in their parish, non-residents, often leaving the work to poorly paid curates. The church's enormous wealth seemed concentrated in the hands of bishops and cathedral chapters, while many parish clergy struggled. Practices like nepotism, appointing family members to church positions, were also common and criticized.
And the church's political stance caused opposition too.
Yes, its close alliance with the Tory party and its resistance to reforms like Catholic emancipation and parliamentary reform made it unpopular with Whigs, radicals, and nonconformists. Lowe mentions an Anglican vicar even endorsing the harsh transportation sentence given to the Tolpuddle martyrs, agricultural laborers who tried to form a trade union in 1834.
But despite all these criticisms, the Church of England still had strong support.
Oh, absolutely. Particularly from the landed aristocracy and high Tories, who saw it as a vital bulwark against revolution and Roman Catholicism. It still controlled the ancient universities of Oxford and Cambridge and most of the prestigious public schools, educating the country's elite.
So the government attempted to reform the church.
Yes, progressive Tories like Peel and leading Whigs realized reforms were urgently needed to strengthen the church and perhaps avoid disestablishment. After the repeal of the Test Incorporation Acts and Catholic emancipation removed some external grievances, Peel set up the Ecclesiastical Duties and Revenues Commission in 1835, crucially including church leaders themselves in the process.
What were their aims?
Quite far-reaching, to eliminate abuses like plurality and non-residence, ensure clergy were adequately paid and lived in their parishes, modernize the church's administrative structure, creating new dioceses, and build more churches, especially in the underserved industrial towns. A series of laws passed between 1836 and 1840 largely achieved these aims, removing the worst abuses and putting the church's finances and administration in much better order.
And new dioceses were created, new churches built.
Yes, between 1836 and 1888, 8 new dioceses were formed, many in expanding industrial areas like Manchester, Ripon, and Liverpool. The church also embarked on an impressive program of building new churches. Over 2,000 new Anglican churches were consecrated between 1831 and 1851 alone, often matching population growth, mostly funded by the church itself or wealthy private supporters.
And alongside this administrative reform, there was a spiritual revival, particularly associated with the Oxford movement.
Yes, the Anglican revival gained a huge boost from the Oxford movement, also known as Tractarianism, which emerged in the 1830s and 1840s. Key figures included John Henry Newman, John Keble, and Edward Pusey, all based at Oxford University. They were deeply concerned about the rise of liberalism, both within the church and in the state's attitude towards the church.
What sparked it?
John Keble's controversial 1833 sermon criticizing the government's Irish Temporalities Bill as unacceptable state interference in church affairs is often seen as the start. The movement published a series of influential tracts for the times, arguing for the church's divine authority and apostolic heritage, and strongly opposing religious liberalism, which allowed for broad interpretations of scripture and doctrine.
And it caused controversy.
Huge controversy. In 1836, they fiercely opposed the appointment of a theological liberal as Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford. Then, Newman's Tract Number 90, published in 1841, argued that the foundational 39 Articles of the Church of England were not fundamentally anti-Catholic, even hinting at compatibility with doctrines like transubstantiation. This caused uproar, upsetting many Anglicans, especially evangelicals.
How did the church hierarchy react?
Church leaders moved against the Tractarians. Newman eventually felt he could no longer remain within the Church of England and converted to Roman Catholicism in 1845. He was followed by some 500 other Anglican clergy over the next few decades.
What was ritualism?
That was a significant byproduct of the Oxford movement's emphasis on the Church's Catholic heritage and the importance of sacraments. It involved a greater emphasis on ceremonial and elaborate forms of worship, things like altar candles, incense, colorful vestments for priests, ornate church decoration, and more elaborate music. While popular with some congregations, others saw these practices as dangerously close to popery, fueling anti-Catholic prejudice and sometimes leading to protests and even riots, like those seen in Exeter and Pimlico. Queen Victoria herself was dismayed, calling ritualists dreadfully aggressive people who must be put down.
Did the government try to stop it?
The Disraeli's government passed the Public Worship Regulation Act in 1874, which banned some specific rituals. This led to a few Anglo-Catholic priests being prosecuted and even jailed for refusing to comply, becoming martyrs in the eyes of their supporters. Despite this, ritualism continued to gain popularity in many parishes.
So what were the overall effects of the Oxford movement? Lowe suggests assessments are mixed.
It's very mixed. Critics saw it as reactionary, doctrinally illiberal, focused on arcane theological points, appealing mainly to the highly educated clergy and upper classes, splitting the church, and largely failing to engage with the pressing social problems of the industrial working class.
But there's a more sympathetic view.
Yes. This view argues it genuinely revitalized the Anglican Church, sparking intense theological discussion and forcing the church as an institution to wake up and reform itself spiritually and pastorally. Some argue that the new ritualism, with its incense-drowned and candlelit ceremonials, actually brought much-needed color and mystery into the lives of people who had nothing in deprived urban parishes.
And it impacted the clergy themselves.
Profoundly. Lowe suggests it set a pattern of spiritual and moral commitment more searching than they had known for several generations. Priests influenced by the movement often took their pastoral role much more seriously. Many dedicated themselves to working in poverty-stricken slum parishes, living among the poor, founding schools and charities, and prioritizing bringing Christianity to the urban masses over purely theological debates. This dedication led to what's been called a recovery in the slums by the Oxford movement of what it had lost in the university.
And the movement also led to religious orders.
Yes. Another significant development was the founding of Anglican religious orders, including orders for women, nuns, who performed invaluable charity work, nursing, and teaching among the poorest sections of society.
Now, while Tractarians did impressive work in the slums, Lowe notes they rarely criticized the social system itself. Who did?
That's where F.D. Maurice and the Christian socialists come in. Most churches at the time, Anglican and nonconformist, tended to endorse dominant Victorian values like self-help, thrift, and temperance. Maurice was one of the first prominent Christian leaders to propose a more radical critique and alternative, Christian socialism.
When did this emerge?
Maurice and his supporters, like Charles Kingsley, were deeply affected by the social unrest and Chartist agitation of the 1840s, and particularly by the European revolutions of 1848. They aimed to publicize the terrible conditions faced by the working class and demonstrate Anglican sympathy, particularly towards the Chartists, showing that Christianity wasn't just for the rich.
What do they argue?
In their tracts on Christian socialism, they argued that the root causes of low wages, unemployment, and poverty lay in the competitive, profit-driven nature of laissez-faire capitalism. Their proposed solution was the formation of workers' cooperatives, where workers would collectively own and manage their workplaces. Though their initial cooperative workshops mostly failed, Maurice was sacked from his professorship at King's College London for his radical views, and the movement faced strong opposition. It was really only the first phase.
So what was its lasting impact?
Christian socialism drew crucial attention to the needs and grievances of working men. It aroused the social conscience of many churchmen. It gave inspiration and vision to working-class leaders. And it significantly propelled the growth of both the cooperative movement and the trade union movement later in the century. Lowe concludes that perhaps its greatest achievement was the vision they gave to others.
Okay, just a couple more things on the religious front. What was papal aggression?
Yes. In 1850, Pope Pius IX decided to restore a normal hierarchical structure for the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales, appointing an Archbishop of Westminster and 12 bishops with territorial dioceses. This was mainly a practical step to better organize and serve the rapidly growing Catholic population, particularly the Irish immigrants. However, this sensible administrative move provoked a furious hostile reaction from many Anglicans and nonconformists in England. It was hysterically labeled the Papal Aggression by the Times newspaper, seen as an arrogant foreign interference. It led to widespread anti-Catholic protests and riots, particularly in cities with large Irish populations like Liverpool and Birkenhead.
And similar tensions existed in Scotland.
Yes, fear of Catholicism also led to anti-Catholic speakers stirring up violence there. And the presence of large numbers of Irish Presbyterian immigrants who brought the fiercely anti-Catholic Orange Order with them created a volatile climate of sectarian tension, orange versus green, leading to frequent riots in cities like Glasgow.
But despite these problems, the Catholic Church was successful in its own way.
Highly successful, Lowe suggests, in ministering to its largely working-class Irish flock. It provided vital spiritual comfort, education through its own schools, social support, and a strong sense of identity in what was often a hostile and alien environment.
And among nonconformists, what was revivalism?
Revivalism was a powerful phenomenon, especially around the mid-century. It involved large gatherings featuring emotional, powerful preaching aimed at securing instant conversions, often accompanied by fervent hymn singing and dramatic personal testimonies. These revivals attracted huge crowds, drawing people from across the social spectrum. Preachers like the Baptist Charles Spurgeon became hugely famous, drawing such vast crowds in London that the 5,000-seat Metropolitan Tabernacle had to be built specifically for him.
And the Salvation Army grew out of this.
A striking offshoot, yes. Founded by William and Catherine Booth in the East End of London in the early 1870s, they believed passionately in active Christianity, taking their message directly to the poorest and most destitute people in pubs, music halls, lodging houses, and on the streets. They adopted military-style uniforms, ranks, and brass bands to attract attention. William Booth is now considered one of England's great social reformers. The army provided practical help alongside evangelism workshops for the unemployed, cheap food stores, night refuges, shelters for prostitutes finding jobs and beds for thousands of homeless people. And Catherine Booth ensured that women played an absolutely equal role in the army's leadership and ministry from the very beginning.
Wow. So wrapping this all up, from the dark realities of industrial squalor and relentless toil, to the vibrant, if sometimes raw, leisure activities, the struggles and slow progress for women, and the deeply personal, often politically charged world of Victorian faith, it's clear that the lives of ordinary Victorians were anything but simple.
Absolutely. We've seen a society grappling with unprecedented, often overwhelming change. Progress was definitely uneven, its benefits were very unequally distributed, especially at first, and the fight for basic rights, safer conditions, better health, education, and just a decent quality of life was a constant, arduous struggle for millions.
The profound social transformations of the Victorian era undeniably reshaped Britain in fundamental ways. But that central question we started with, how ordinary lives truly fared amidst it all, remains, as Lowe shows us, a really complex tapestry of hardship, exploitation, incremental improvements, surprising resilience, and constant adaptation.
It really does. And looking back at their experience, it perhaps raises an important question for us today, doesn't it? In our own age of rapid technological and social change, what lessons can we draw from the Victorian experience about ensuring that progress, whatever that means, now genuinely serves the well-being, dignity, and opportunities of all citizens, not just a select few?